Before we get started with the main drawings on this DVD, let's talk about a few basic elements. This first one is shading, and in this first circle I'm hatching. I'm going to show three different techniques here, although two of them will undoubtedly look exactly identical to each other because my ADD on this first ball kicked in too soon and I went against my statement, which was to make the entire ball nothing but shade lines with using hatching only. I've gone against myself and I've done some cross hatching as I'm doing right now. Hatching would be taking all of the strokes and pulling them in one direction, from the light side to the dark side, all the way into the reflected light and into the cast shadows. From corner to corner on that page, whatever I design on the page is all going to be shaded in the same direction. That would be hatching. The objective of shading something in is to make it feel three-dimensional. So as I'm shading this shadow pattern in, what I'm looking for is a flatness, trying to define the entire shadow pattern with one tone in the very beginning. And that one tone helps me see whether or not I have what looks like a light source hitting an object that has a certain quality to it, in this case a spherical quality. The edge between the light and the dark that I'm creeping up to in the middle of the ball is called the terminator. The terminator is where the light and the dark meet, and is where the shadow pattern begins, and sometimes along that edge you'll see something called a core shadow. What I'm developing now has the illusion of a core shadow, although I'm not going to be building one up too drastically within any of these balls because they are all dark, sitting on a very black object, and the black surface is not allowing any reflected light or very little reflected light to fill in the shadowy side. If there's very little reflected light, you won't have a punctual core shadow, or you won't have a band between the light and the dark that looks even darker. A core shadow is a surface that's facing more towards your eyes than any of the other surfaces on the object. And that surface is facing towards your eyes in the same space where the light source is falling away or ending on that surface. So you could say that it's the apex of the surface before it retreats into the shade. And that core shadow tells a few different things. One, it tells about the type of object that we're looking at. And two, it tells about the volume of that object that's sticking out or coming forward towards us. If you develop up all of the tones on the surface correctly, then what you build in 2 dimensions will look like it's 3-dimensional. So here I'm back to hatching again, and this was my main intention of this ball, was to take all of the tones and pull them in one consistent direction. Now I'm going to do another thing here that I did not mean to do, and that is use my fingers to smudge out some of these tones. My intention was to use a nice hard pencil and shade everything in so that the tones themselves, just by the pencil tip, have a nice ambient quality to them and fall off in nice gradations. Another problem that I have is that I like to dig into the pictures that I draw and use everything from my elbows to my eyeballs to rub, to smudge, to blend, to build additions to anything that I'm drawing. I really get into it. And there is a problem with using your fingers. On a paper like the paper that I'm using here, which is smooth newsprint being 6 degrees from toilet paper, which means cheap paper, this newsprint is very fragile, and anything that's oily, like our bodies, will ruin the surface. So the more I use my fingers on this surface, the more I'm rubbing my oils into the surface and damaging the paper. 2 things are happening. The first is that I'm embedding oil into the paper, and any tone that's in between the oil and the paper is not going to rub out very easily or at all. Even using the strongest of erasers won't help. The other problem is that where I'm rubbing my finger over the surface, I'm also pulling the fabric apart, or the weave apart, on the paper. That is, all of the little fibers that create this surface have been woven together in such a way, and by using my finger I'm disrupting that surface and causing abrasion to it, which is pulling it up and ruining that particular space. So 3/4 of my pad is now going to have, or 3/4 of my page is now going to have a nice smoothness to it, and in the areas that I've used my fingers there's going to be a roughness to it. So as I started with a smooth sheet of newsprint, I've now ended with a rough and smooth sheet of newsprint. So yes, you can see that I tried really hard to do some hatching throughout the entire drawing, but I kept coming back to cross hatching. I broke my course of action here. That was not a good thing to do. But you can see that the end goal here is to create a unity on the surface, to get all the tones to join together to create sort of a continuum of tone. And that continuum goes from the lightest side to the darkest side. It goes from the front all the way around to the back. And if you shade these surfaces in the right way, you will have an audience believing that what they're looking at is three-dimensional. So, fingers aside, you really do want to learn how to use your materials so that you can create nice, smooth, even tones, or nice linear drawings, or nice tonal drawings, or on and on and on. A pencil is very versatile. There's a lot of different things that you can learn with it. But you want to try to draw pictures using just that material and nothing else to get in the way of the material. Just for the sake of learning what types of effects these tools can provide. A pencil has a multitude of effects that it can create, but without practicing, without giving it a shot, and by using other things like your fingers, you're not giving yourself the chance to really push it all the way through and find out what the full range or the full gamut of the tool's potential is. So every now and again I do come back to hatching. That's what I'm doing here. I'm hatching. And as I'm hatching up more tones, what I'm doing is I'm laying small patches of tone over small patches of tone and hoping that the overlap of each patch will create that smooth effect and get rid of any kind of abrasions or anything big and chunky that gets in the way between one part of the ball and the other part of the ball. I'm going back and forth between the darker side and the lighter side. As I build up more halftones in the light, it allows me to alter the darks in such a way so I can continue to keep the distance between the light and the dark ever present. The distance would be the dark side being a value 7 or 8 and the light side being a maximum of a value 2 or 3. And what I'm speaking about with value means that on a scale from light to dark, white to black, we have a series of values. And in an artistic sense, the scale is measured between 0 and 10, a 10 value spectrum. There's millions of values to the eye, but as far as limiting things and measuring things within the arts, we have to build a chart, and that chart is a maximum setting and a minimum setting. And then we define what goes on in between with a scale of sorts. And so the art scale is defined through the value system. 0 being white, 10 being black. And so when I'm speaking about the dark being an 8, we're getting closer to black. And when I'm speaking of the light being a 2 or a 3, we're getting much closer to a white. And the distance between those two values is greater than less. That means that there's about a 5 value distance between the lightest and the darkest value. Therefore, we have what's called high contrast. And the value range from the lights to the darks will be much greater than if we had a minimum range of values between the lights and the darks. This second ball that I'm filling in using a technique called veiling. And veiling is a series of slinky lines or springs. Well, basically what I mean is that the pencil moves in a spiral effect. And as I spiral the pencil, the lines overlap themselves and create a noise, much like hatching does with the little spots in between the weave. The spirals have little circles in the middle, like a donut. And as I weave more and more of these patches over the top of each other, they tighten down or shrink those circles, eventually filling them completely in, making a nice smooth tone. And here I am cheating it and speeding things up by using my finger, which I actually shouldn't be doing. I should be trying to create the effect using just the materials. I have mentioned this before. I have artistic ADD and I like to use everything under the sun from my nose to my toes. And when I draw, I like to have everything at my disposal, just in case I need to smudge something out, blend something, move something over, or create an effect. When we're smudging the tones, what we're looking for is a greater strength of believability on the object that we're shading. And the smudging is sort of a way of shortcutting the lengthy process of filling something in, although that should not be an excuse for doing things the proper way. And the proper way is just the academic approach to learning. I wouldn't call the academic approach being the proper way to make a picture. It's just the proper way to learn. And what you're doing when you're learning academically is you're learning something based upon something out in front of you, something that can be controlled and measured. Once you understand the tools that you're learning through that measure, then you can appropriate those tools in any way you choose. That will become your technique. The rules that you're learning, however, have a certain quality to them that, like I said, can be measured. And because they can be measured, a dialogue can be formed between the student and the instructor on how to get to where you need to go. And once you've arrived at that conclusion, and you can do that successfully, repeatedly, then you're ready to go. And you can move on to developing your own technique in whatever way possible, or deemed the most worthy way of you doing your work the way you need it to be expressed or crafted. So going back to this ball here, I'm still using the veiling technique. I have not broken routine here. There really is no way that I can. As long as I keep my hand spiraling, I will be doing the effect the way it needs to be done. And I'm developing up the tones heading towards the lightest value. So I'm working from dark to light. And in the first ball, and it will be in the third ball, I'm going to do the same thing. Dark to light is a typical way of working when you have a very light surface. The white of the paper is considered the maximum range that you can reach in the lightest direction, and the black marks that you make with your charcoal are considered the maximum range in the dark direction. So it would be said then that on a white piece of paper, you probably want to make dark marks first, so you set up for yourself the entire range from the lightest to the darkest part that you're going to be drawing within that value spectrum. If you're working on a dark paper, it would be a good idea to start with a light value so that you set up that same kind of maximum range in the opposite direction. So as I'm building my way up towards the highlight on the ball, I'm using a lighter touch. I haven't switched pencils yet. I'm using the same hardness, and I believe that the hardness on this pencil is a 2B. So what I have to do is micromanage my penmanship, or the amount of pressure that I'm applying to the paper as I'm pushing more tone into the picture space. And you can see that I'm using my fingers to smudge those tones, which is sort of a cheating method here. I should have been trying for nice even tones, utilizing just the veiling. And here it looks like I'm hatching, but I'm actually spinning the pencil in longer ovals. I'm still doing the same technique over the entire surface. I'm consolidating though, and I'm not working as meticulously. When you want the smallest pores to be filled in, you tighten down on those little ovals or those little spirals, and you make them very short. If you want to fill in a space really quickly, go ahead and broaden those ovals and make them into large ovals that cross over the entire distance of the page or the object that you're filling in. Keep in mind, however, the larger you make those shapes, the harder they are to fill in because you have such large spaces in between each of those strokes. It's going to take a lot of time to bridge the gap between each of those lines that have been created. So now I'm using the same pencil and I'm building up that terminator edge, and I'm doing it using more of the veiling strokes. I'm just applying more and more layers. And as I build up those layers, I don't think I'm necessarily pushing harder. I'm just building up more tone in those spaces, and as a result, it's piling up. And when it's piling up, it's getting darker. And that's the effect that I'm shooting for here, is a darker edge. Pushing down on the pencil really hard, making abrasive marks, doesn't make a better dark, and it doesn't help get to the dark quicker. because you still have to alter the dark. You still have to alter the edges of your markings. And if you make a nice dark mark and you embed it into the page all at one time, sometimes that mark isn't going to be very easy to remove off of the surface or alter. So it's questionable putting dark marks down quickly. If you're going to build something up thoughtfully, you're taking your time. And when you're taking your time, you're layering or you're building things up. You're not just jumping right in and going. If you're doing a quick sketch, however, a nice dark marking might be the ultimate way to go because it just gets you what you need as a result right then and there very effectively. So I know I'm not supposed to be using my finger to smudge these tones, but what I want to say about what I was just doing, I was spinning my finger in a veiling fashion or in a veiled fashion. I'm spinning my finger around in an orbital motion, and I'm doing the same thing with my finger that I'm doing with the pencil. I'm replicating the movement so that when the tones grind together, they're doing it in the same way as if I was just using the pencil tip. That will keep a consistency or a thorough look to this all the way through, no matter how much I alter the surface. So what I'm doing now is double checking where the gaps are in the surface and filling those in. Doing the same thing, I'm veiling, I'm spinning the pencil, making a spiral, and as I'm doing that, I'm double checking to see how the tones fit together. It's a way, or there is a way where you sit back just far enough, and as you're building up your tones, the distance that your eyes are to the page, the distance is just enough to where you can see the entire object being built. And as you're looking at that object being built up, your mind and your artistic eye can see the surface as it's getting built up. And as it sees that surface getting built up, it can find errors immediately. If you go too dark, or you go too abrasively, or you put a scored line into the page, which means just something really dark where everything else has been nice and balanced, your mind and your eye will see that, and it will stop you or prevent you from adding more until you fix it. That's the ultimate goal. A lot of the time we just look at those bad marks and go, oh yeah, I made another mistake, and we just keep pushing forward anyway. The problem with doing that, unless you're well trained and you can control your own habits or your own working conditions, those errors lead to more errors. And what we're trying to do is prevent ourselves from making too many errors, so at the very end of the picture, we're not going back in and making several more hours of adjustments. We're just finishing strokes and completing the picture as needed. All right, so we've jumped into this third circle, and this one is done with what's called cross-hatching, or what I've noted over to the left, X-hatching. The X means cross. So cross-hatching is like hatching, only you're using both line directions to mute or to simplify the surface and make it flatter. If you don't use your fingers to smudge the tones, you can get a nice, effective, smooth surface just cross-hatching alone. In fact, with any of these techniques, you should be able to build up a nice, smooth surface. It's called patience, something that I've only recently developed. Patience is a good thing, and it helps you develop something up nicely. You take your time and build something up, and the object, the drawing, the sculpture, whatever it is that you're doing artistically, will have a care to it that others will appreciate because you took the time and the patience to develop up something with care in mind. I almost started smudging there with the finger. But you can see that when I first lay these tones down, there's quite a bit of space between the lines. And I think I'm doing that for the instructional purpose here so that you can see what it is that I'm doing. But keep in mind here too, I'm not using my finger to fill in the gaps, I'm using more hatch lines to fill in the gaps. So that means that you could start off with these lines 6 feet apart from each other if you needed to, and as long as you have the patience to sit there and develop up all the other lines in between, there's no reason why you couldn't build all this up all the way to completion without ever needing to smudge anything. Smudging tools include your fingers, paper towels or any kind of soft paper, blending stumps, brushes, sables and bristles alike, and almost anything else that has a softness to it, like material. Your sleeve, for example, if you're drawing in charcoal and you're wearing a sweatshirt, sometimes your sweatshirt cuff might rub over the drawing and it's going to smudge your tones. And in those areas that are smudged, they start taking on a completely different impression because the tones are blended rather than hatched or applied just using the pencil. So when you've had that experience, you realize that, oh, I'm not making a mistake. I'm making a discovery here that anything can blend charcoal. As long as you know that you're ruining a surface, the more you blend into the surface because you're grinding the tones into the weave and you're displacing the weave, then if you're fine with that, that's okay. If you're building a picture up archivally, meaning that you know this picture is important and then you know that it's going to be hanging in a museum or a gallery forever, then you want to be really careful about how you build stuff up. Oh, he used his fingers. What? See, again, that artistic ADD jumps in there. But at least you got enough of the impression of what we're doing here to understand that there's several different ways that you can build up tones. And all of these different methods that you've just watched me do are performed using a wax-based media. That means that with the pencil, there's a binder in it that holds all of that material together within the wood shaft. Typically, that's a wax-based binder. Most pencils are wax-based binders. I haven't used vine charcoal, willow charcoal, charcoal powder, pastels, or compressed charcoal yet, but this same technique applies to all of those materials. Your arm moves radially, your arm moves linearly, so every marking that you make is going to have some kind of impress in that respect. There is a way of drawing using a randomness, but it's randomness between both those linear and radial markings that you make, and you have to be aware that you're making random markings. If you notice, I'm using the eraser to pull out the highlight on this surface, and I've made the eraser a pencil by forming an edge that's sharp, and then I hatch out little lines in the reverse direction that I'm using the pencil to put down dark markings. And that's shading.